In 1990, Christopher J. Scarver was awaiting trial in a Wisconsin jail accused of killing 27-year-old job trainer Stephen Lohman. It was then that the arrest of a 31-year-old Milwaukee man was announced. He had the remains of 11 men and boys in his apartment. That man later confessed to killing a total of 17 men and boys in Ohio and Wisconsin. He also confessed that he would sometimes mutilate and cannibalize his victims. Scarver came to know serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer much like the rest of America via the news. But Scarver got to see more of Dahmer than most people. Both men were convicted murderers serving out life sentences together in the Columbia Correctional Institution outside of Madison. Although Scarver was also a convicted murderer, he couldn't stomach the things he'd heard Dahmer had done. Scarver later told the New York Post that Dahmer would antagonize inmates by making food look like severed body parts and leave them for people to find. Scarver said he kept his distance from Dahmer until 1994. Scarver claims when the two were left alone in the prison gym, he bludgeoned Dahmer to death with a metal rod. He also killed another inmate at the same time named Jesse Anderson. According to what Scarver told the New York Post, Anderson and Dahmer antagonized him, so he killed them. Scarver initially pleaded not guilty of the prison murders, claiming insanity.
At his first court appearance, Scarver entered the courtroom singing.
Rain or shine, sharing your dreams, your heart and your mind.
But he later changed his plea to no contest. He did so in exchange for being moved to a federal prison instead of serving out his life sentences in a state penitentiary. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences on top of the first one. The insanity plea wasn't out of the blue. When Scarver was awaiting trial for killing Lohman in 1992, he told a psychiatrist that voices had urged him to commit that murder. Specifically, he said it was the voices of a family, a mom and a dad, a boy, and a little girl. Scarver shot Lohman in the head 4 times, then made a manager write him a check for $3,000. He also stole the manager's credit card. Scarver went to his girlfriend's home, where hours later, police found him sitting on the stoop of her apartment. He had the check, the credit card, and the gun he used in the murder in his pocket. Scarver told the psychologist he'd never been in trouble with the law or even been in a fight. He said the voices of the family told him everything was going to be all right and it was meant to happen like this. The New York Times reported that he said the voices also told him, quote, "I'm the chosen one." Scarver has been in jail or prison since he was about 20 years old. According to his webpage, he was placed in solitary confinement for 18 years after killing Jeffrey Dahmer and Jesse Anderson. But he, quote, earned his way out and into a medium security prison. When he was initially arrested for murder in 1990, his girlfriend was pregnant and gave birth after Scarver was sentenced. The child was named Chris after his father, and the two maintained a relationship through letters, according to what his son told CNN in 2014. During his time behind bars, Scarver became a poet and wrote a book titled The Child Left Behind, Poetry of Christopher J. Scarver. Scarver also writes short stories, musical compositions, and songs, and creates art. He's proactive in writing prison policy proposals and initiated the American Prisoner Repatriation Act. Scarver also tries to encourage his son. In part of a letter the younger Chris shared with CNN, Scarver wrote, "Tough times don't last, tough people do, and you are the toughest kid I know." Did Jeffrey Dahmer beg for his life before he was killed in prison? Did he ask forgiveness for his crimes? Or did he resign himself to his fate? We have the answer. Known to be the most notorious murderer to come out of the state of Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer was finally apprehended in 1991 and sentenced to 957 years in state prison. The so-called Milwaukee cannibal confessed to taking the lives of 17 young men. Dahmer had a seemingly normal upbringing in the small town of Doylestown, Ohio. Beneath the surface, however, were a number of family issues that bubbled up on and off while Dahmer and his brother were growing up. Soon, Dahmer's teachers began noticing the boy becoming more and more withdrawn. As also told by Netflix's new true crime series Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, he spent his younger years abusing the corpses of animals he had found dead on the side of the road. In June 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered his first victim, and he took his second in 1987. After that, his crimes escalated. His MO was to lure young men back to his apartment, where he would then drug, sexually assault, and kill them. While almost a decade had passed between his first 2 murders, Dahmer murdered 1 man a year from 1987 to 1989, and 4 more in 1990. The urge was growing well beyond Dahmer's control as 1991 drew on. When the last man he lured into his apartment managed to escape to the police, investigators moved in and were met with one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Skulls and severed heads were found in his refrigerator, as well as photographs of numerous victims post-mortem. It only took a few moments for those on the scene to realize that they were about to apprehend a serial killer. Dahmer was put on trial soon after, and the jury rejected his plea of insanity. Instead, they sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, with an additional term added later. Dahmer appeared to show remorse in court and profusely apologized to the public and the families of his numerous victims. Dahmer probably knew that he would never have a life outside of prison. After hearing from the family members of Dahmer's victims, Dahmer was allowed to address the court before he was sentenced for his crimes. He did not deny any of the atrocities that he was convicted of committing. Rather, he took responsibility for his actions and insisted that none of his crimes were motivated by hatred. In his statement, he told the court,
"I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick."
Dahmer stated that he was thankful that he would never be able to harm anyone ever again. In his statement, Dahmer revealed that the reason he wanted to stand for trial was so that there wouldn't be any unanswered questions, and that he hoped that anyone with disorders similar to his would be able to get help.
"And if I could give my life right now to bring their loved ones back, I would do it."
Dahmer also appeared to realize that he was about to be handed the maximum sentence allowable by law. Admitting that he deserved to receive whatever sentence he was about to be handed, Dahmer's last word to the court was, "I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration." Dahmer began serving his prison sentence at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Here, Dahmer began studying the Bible and declared himself to be a born-again Christian. His stay in prison wasn't a long one, however. While cleaning the prison showers on the morning of November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was attacked by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. Scarver used a metal bar to strike Dahmer over the head, taking the killer off guard. Scarver then began beating Dahmer without restraint. Dahmer was found alive by prison workers who then called for an ambulance. He was unconscious and barely alive and died from his injuries soon after being taken into medical care. When questioned by authorities, Scarver declared that he had been, in his words, the chosen one to carry out Dahmer's death. Scarver also revealed to authorities the chilling details of Dahmer's murder. After striking Dahmer with the metal bar, Scarver reported that Dahmer stated, "I don't care if I live or die. Go ahead and kill me."
Can a mother love a killer? And what happens after he's caught? In the case of Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, we know more than you might expect. When it was discovered that Milwaukee serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer had murdered, sexually assaulted, and cannibalized 17 young men and boys, the thoughts of many naturally went to his victims and their families.
I hope you can deal with what you've done.
After Dahmer's arrest and as gruesome details of his killing spree were revealed, his parents Lionel and Joyce Dahmer also found themselves caught up in the media frenzy. At that time, the public and journalists alike wondered if there was something in Jeffrey's family history that might help explain his behavior. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in 1991, and in 1992, he was sentenced to 16 life sentences. He was killed in prison by another inmate just 2 years later. In 1994, Jeffrey's father Lionel wrote about his experience in the book A Father's Story. He has since contributed to a number of shows and documentaries about his son's crimes. But what is known about Jeffrey Dahmer's mother? As Lionel Dahmer wrote in his book, he and Joyce divorced while Jeffrey was still a teenager. Joyce Dahmer, born Joyce Flint on February 7, 1936, experienced mental health challenges all her own, with prolonged periods of depression, among other serious symptoms of what was later diagnosed as postpartum psychosis. Lionel Dahmer wrote, "Joyce had gone into an acute depression. She was extremely irritable and spent much of her time in bed. Joyce was prescribed barbiturates and morphine for the condition. In the chaotic aftermath of their divorce, Jeffrey stayed with his father and stepmother, Sherry. He began drinking soon after and took the life of his first victim in 1978, less than a year after he had learned of his parents' divorce. Joyce still kept in touch with her son while he was in prison, and they spoke on a weekly basis. During a telephone interview in August 1995, she said, "When I think of what Jeff did, I stop breathing. I asked him, 'Do you still have these urges?' He said, 'Yes, Mom. I'm so glad I'm locked up. I'd be afraid what I'd do if I weren't locked up.'" The whole time, Joyce continued to contend that her son was insane. She continued, "Milwaukee turned my son into a demon. They didn't give him an insanity verdict. I do not deny that what my son did was horrible. Nobody listens. He didn't know what he was doing."
He's not a monster, he's a human being. And I think he deserves some help.
Though Jeffrey confessed to the killings, he pleaded not guilty at first, and then changed his plea to guilty by virtue of insanity, a defense strategy the jury in the case found unconvincing. In 1994, the same year her son was murdered in prison, Joyce attempted suicide in California. She was discovered unconscious but alive in her home. Joyce attempted suicide again in 1996 on Jeffrey's birthday. For the most part, Joyce kept a lower profile than her estranged husband Lionel. She turned down interview offers and never wrote a book or spoke publicly much about her experience as Jeffrey Dahmer's mother. In 2000, Joyce Dahmer, by then going by the name Joyce Flint again, died at the age of 64 from breast cancer in Fresno, California. After moving there shortly after her divorce, she worked at a retirement home and as a case manager in HIV and AIDS advocacy. Before she died, Joyce fought to have her son's brain preserved for scientific study so that, in her view, similar crimes could be avoided in the future. Lionel Dahmer disagreed. The brain was preserved for a time, and Jeffrey Dahmer's body was cremated. The brain was cremated later. According to one Dahmer defense attorney, she had to live with the idea that she was the mother of a monster, and it drove her crazy. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by dialing 988 or by calling 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8255.
Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested at his Milwaukee apartment in 1991, and when the full extent of his crimes came to light, everyone was shocked, even the FBI. He remains one of the most notorious serial killers in U.S. history. This is the truth about Jeffrey Dahmer. At the heart of the horrors is, of course, Jeffrey Dahmer himself. When it came time for experts to determine if he was fit to stand trial, forensic psychiatrist Dr. George Palermo spent more than 12 hours interviewing him. Per the Chicago Tribune, he found Dahmer to be highly intelligent, emotionally tranquil, and his thinking processes were logical and rational. And somehow, that makes what they found in his apartment more terrifying. When the Associated Press picked up the story of Dahmer's arrest from the Milwaukee Sentinel in July 1991, they reported, police found 11 skulls scattered in a file cabinet, a closet, a refrigerator, and a freezer, and 3 headless torsos in a vat in the man's bedroom.
He said, we found 11 skulls. That was horrible.
For history, that vat was a 57-gallon drum filled with chemicals that were contributing to the slow decomposition of the bodies inside. There were 3 heads in the refrigerator, as well as evidence some of the victims had been cannibalized. When police began emptying the apartment and his neighbors started to realize what was happening, the smells reportedly became clear. Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a few Polaroid pictures carelessly left in plain sight. It wasn't until officers got a glimpse of those that they realized something was deeply wrong, as they doubted the man who fled to them for help. This was depicted in the 2002 movie Dahmer, in which Jeremy Renner played the infamous serial killer. As reported by Time, Jeffrey Dahmer spent 10 months in prison for fondling a 13-year-old boy in 1988 and offering him $50 to pose nude for pictures. After 10 months in jail, he regularly met with his probation officer, who, in turn, never checked Dahmer's home. That freedom, history says, coincided with the first of Dahmer's victims, who had vanished in March 1989. Just 2 months after that disappearance, Dahmer was before a judge, promising his child-molesting ways were behind him. Fast forward to July 22, 1992. That's when Tracy Edwards escaped from Dahmer's apartment. He later testified for the Los Angeles Times. He put his head on my chest, was listening to my heart, and said he was going to eat my heart. After watching The Exorcist 3, Edwards was able to hit and flee from a distracted Dahmer.
So as I was walking past the guy, I hit him, right?
Heading out into the city, Edwards found a police car and told officers what had happened, and showed them the handcuffs still around his wrist. When he took the doubting officers back to the apartment, Dahmer originally tried to explain the incident away as a domestic dispute, but that's when officers spotted the pictures. Dahmer was arrested without incident.
No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
A 2005 study published in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology found childhood abuse, including physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, was present in the history of a high percentage of people who grew up to become serial killers. When it comes to Jeffrey Dahmer, his case is a little unique in that his father wrote a book about raising his son and the problems he saw from a young age. In interviews his parents gave after his arrest, they described Dahmer as a toddler, saying he was a happy young boy who loved animals and nature. But things started changing when Dahmer was just 4 years old and had surgery to repair a double hernia. Afterwards, he became convinced his genitals had been removed. His father has suggested that was connected to his later habit of castrating his victims. And he's also pointed the finger at other elements of his son's childhood that may have had some severely negative impacts on him. That includes being witness to the side effects his mother experienced after starting anti-anxiety medication, along with abandonment issues stemming from parents that largely left him, and later his little brother, to fend for themselves. Research done by Regis University suggests Jeffrey Dahmer's fascination with death started at about the same time as his hernia surgery, and an incident recounted by his father. Lionel Dahmer says 4-year-old Jeffrey was fascinated with a pile of bones under their home, and Jeffrey's interest in the dead and dying only increased. When Jeffrey Dahmer was in the 9th grade, he was given a biology assignment that involved dissecting a fetal pig. He not only happily completed the assignment, but kept the skeleton, which kicked off an obsession with collecting others. At first, those came from along the roadside, and Dahmer spent his formative years collecting dead animals and mutilating them further. The Miami Herald says Dahmer also killed the pets of his neighbors, mounting their heads on sticks. Today, animal cruelty is considered one of the warning signs a child might escalate in adulthood. The FBI started maintaining a database to track instances of animal cruelty in 2016, and stresses that instances of abuse need to be reported. John Backturf says he occasionally wondered what happened to his old school chum Jeffrey Dahmer, but it wasn't until 1991 headlines that he learned what his buddy had been up to. Backturf told The Independent, "There was always a darkness about him that was really kind of repellent. I was okay with hanging out with him if there was other people around. I was never going to be alone with him, and I'm pretty happy I had that instinct, because that could have well been me chopped up in the trunk of his car." Backturf was already an established artist when he decided to tell his story in the form of the graphic novel My Friend Dahmer. The 2012 work, which was turned into a movie, tried to shine some light on what it was like going to school with him. Dahmer, he says, started acting out in high school, when he would fake seizures and mock locals with disabilities. Backturf and his friends jokingly formed the Dahmer Fan Club.
The Jeff Dahmer Fan Club was a group of us who thought Jeff Dahmer was just a funny kid.
Backturf wrote, "All those things he perfected when he was very young through our goofball antics, he used them when he was a monster. That's a little hard to live with." Backturf also wondered where all the adults were at the time. He explained, "They didn't care. They just figured, well, next year he'll be somebody else's problem." And of course, he was somebody else's problem. Jeffrey Dahmer's parents finalized their divorce on July 24, 1978. About a month prior to that, he killed his first victim. Stephen Hicks had been hitchhiking to a concert, and when he didn't come home, his parents didn't think anything of it. They reported him missing 6 days later, but he was already dead. It wasn't until 1991 that law enforcement connected Hicks's disappearance with Dahmer, and it was also then they started taking a close look at Dahmer's 1978 home in Ohio. The New York Times reported, "After hours of combing through woods and underbrush, local officials today found more than 50 bone fragments, a substantial quantity of blood, and a bloody handprint in the crawl space. That would quickly escalate to 500 bone fragments, and Dahmer would eventually confess to picking up Hicks, inviting him home for a drink, and smashing him first with a barbell, then destroying his remains with a sledgehammer. And he was nearly caught. Dahmer was pulled over by police when he was disposing of Hicks's body, and officers asked him why he had plastic bags in his car. He convinced them he was just getting some air, and, distraught over his parents' impending divorce, he was taking the garbage to the dump while he was out. Officers let him go. Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the military and was sent to Germany in 1979, where he was attached to a medic unit. One of the other men in the unit, Preston Davis, says he was drugged, then sexually assaulted by Dahmer, telling The Independent in 2013, "I'm just thankful to be alive to tell the story." After Davis left, he was replaced by a soldier named Billy Joe Capshaw. After being sexually assaulted multiple times, Capshaw jumped from a third-story window, survived, and reported the assaults. Superior officers returned him to the barracks where the abuse continued, and after he left the military, he spent 5 years locked in his own room. After years of therapy and a friendship with Dahmer's other victim, he was finally able to talk about what happened. Conorak Synthensymphoam was among the 11 victims whose remains were discovered at Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment. And his story starts years prior. The 13-year-old boy Dahmer had been convicted of molesting in 1988 was Konarek's older brother. The family was told Dahmer had been incarcerated for his crimes, but in 1991, he lured Konarek to his apartment with promises he'd pay him for posing for a few photos. Dahmer drugged him, drilled a hole in his skull, and injected him with hydrochloric acid. He was still unconscious when Dahmer left for the store, and Dahmer was still gone when he woke. Konarek was running down the street when he came across Nicole Childress and Sandra Smith. They called police, but by that time, Dahmer was on the street again to reclaim his victim. Dahmer claimed the boy was his house guest and was ultimately released by police, who escorted them both back to Dahmer's apartment, then threatened to arrest Smith for her continued insistence that something was deeply wrong. Konarek was dead half an hour later. In spite of the fact that Dahmer already had another body in his apartment, the officers testified, per the New York Times, that they believed the two had, quote, a caring relationship. Officer Joseph Gabrish said, "We're trained to be observant. I've been doing this for a while, and usually if something stands out, you'll spot it. There just wasn't anything there." Jeffrey Dahmer's parents have spoken out about their son, and his father, Lionel, even wrote a book, A Father's Story, in an attempt to make sense out of what had happened. Discussing the book, Oxygen reported, the dad often blamed himself for Jeffrey's severe flaws. Lionel said he was negligent and probably didn't give enough to Jeffrey emotionally. Jeffrey's mother, Joyce Flint, told the Seattle Times in 1993, "I wake up every morning and for a split second, I don't know I'm Jeffrey Dahmer's mother, and then it all floods in." She later told Hard Copy, "I still love my son. I've never stopped loving my son." Flint died of breast cancer in 2000, having spent much of her life working as a case manager for the Central Valley AIDS team. She also founded an HIV community center called The Living Room. After Jeffrey Dahmer's confession and conviction came jail, and while he was there, he started receiving a ton of fan mail. In 1994, the Associated Press reported that Dahmer had already received a shocking $12,000 in letters that were sent to him from across the globe. Some sent him money to spend on creature comforts, while others sent donations as gifts, with at least one woman hoping that the $350 she sent him would encourage him to learn about Christ. The New Statesman took a look at some of the so-called serial killer fandoms and found a secret Facebook group filled with Dahmer fans. The publication spoke with one member who revealed that she felt connected to Dahmer and explained, "It's not that I agreed with what he did, but I understood the triggers. Society has a lot to answer for in terms of how people turn out." Jeffrey Dahmer was ultimately sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms, and at first he spent some time in protective custody. After a year in jail, he asked to be returned to a more communal area, and he started to spend time, sometimes unsupervised, with other prisoners. That's where things went sideways. There was an attempt on his life in 1994 at a chapel service the newly baptized Dahmer was attending. Then, on November 28, 1994, Dahmer was bludgeoned to death by another inmate named Christopher Scarver. Scarver later talked to the New York Post and explained why he'd done it, saying, "He crossed the line with some people, prisoners, prison staff. Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them." If you or anyone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, help is available. Visit the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network website or contact RAIN's National Helpline at 1-800-656-HOPE, 1-800-656-4673.
What happens to the body of a serial killer after they die? In the case of Jeffrey Dahmer, it was yet another thing for his parents to argue about. In terms of number of victims, Jeffrey Dahmer isn't the most horrific serial killer in American history. Dahmer had 17 victims compared to the likes of Ted Bundy, who had as many as 35 victims, and Gerald Stano, who had as many as 41. But Dahmer's killings were very gruesome. Dahmer sexually assaulted at least some of his victims before killing them, as well as afterward. He also mutilated some of his victims. He reportedly kept parts for display and ate pieces. He even drilled holes in living victims' skulls and poured acid inside. Dahmer's case also shone a light on the failings of the Milwaukee Police Department and Wisconsin's criminal justice system, both of which had opportunities to stop Dahmer before he killed more. For example, according to the Milwaukee Sentinel, neighbors tried valiantly to get the police to intervene in the case of a teenager Dahmer had kidnapped. While the victim was trying to escape, police told the neighbors to stay out of it. In 1992, Dahmer was finally convicted for 15 of the murders he committed. He was sentenced to a life sentence for each. He told the court at the time,
"I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself."
Dahmer was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. In 1994, he became the victim of his own murder in prison. After his death, Dahmer's body was cremated in Madison, Wisconsin. His parents, Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Flint, had divorced when the killer was 18 after a troubled marriage. They were still estranged when Dahmer died, and they quarreled over the disposition of his remains. Each parent was to receive half of the ashes, but there was a problem. According to the New York Times, Flint had asked that her son's brain be donated to a university for study to see if there was a physiological problem that contributed to his behavior. His father wanted it cremated along with the rest of his body. Ultimately, the killer's body was cremated without the brain, but following a court decision, his brain too was eventually cremated as well. How exactly did Dahmer die in prison? Initially, his jailers kept him in solitary confinement out of fear that other inmates might wish him harm or want to make a name for themselves by killing America's most infamous serial killer. After a few months in solitary, Dahmer asked to be moved to a less restrictive environment. Since he'd been a model prisoner up to that point, jailers granted his request. He was moved into a unit for prisoners with emotional problems and was able to attend classes, eat meals with other inmates, and perform work duties. However, once he was among other inmates, he decided to tell jokes that were apparently only funny to him. He would tell guards and other prisoners that he would bite, and then delight in their nervous reactions. He would also shape bits of food into body parts, using ketchup to represent blood. In July 1994, a fellow prisoner tried to kill Dahmer, but was unsuccessful. Dahmer asked not to be sent back to solitary and remained in the general population. A few months later, another inmate succeeded in killing Dahmer. According to the New York Post, Christopher Scarver, who entered the facility around the same time, killed Dahmer. Scarver said that he never interacted with Dahmer up until the day that he killed him. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Scarver, Dahmer, and inmate Jesse Anderson were cleaning a bathroom in the gym. They had been left unsupervised. Someone, it's not clear if it was Dahmer or Anderson, playfully poked Scarver in the back. Scarver heard them laughing. When he had a chance, Scarver followed Dahmer, retrieved a piece of weight equipment, and bludgeoned the convicted murderer in the head, killing him. Scarver would later say that he killed Dahmer because of the killer's jokes about his crimes and how he taunted the other inmates. He also said that prison officials may have played a role in Dahmer's death by leaving him unsupervised with Scarver, who they knew hated him. Scarver told the New York Post, "They had something to do with what took place, yes." If you or anyone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, help is available. Visit the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network website or contact RAIN's National Helpline at 1-800-656-HOPE 4673.
Prison can chew you up and spit you out. But what did it do to a monster like Jeffrey Dahmer? Keep watching to find out. On July 22, 1991, authorities in Milwaukee were led to the apartment of Jeffrey Dahmer by a man who escaped after being held captive there. Immediately upon arrival, authorities noted a foul odor inside the apartment. On further inspection, they found crates full of chemicals, a drawer full of macabre Polaroid photos, and numerous body parts, including 5 severed heads. Dahmer was ultimately charged and convicted of 15 counts of first-degree murder and subsequently sentenced to 15 life terms, which were to be served consecutively.
I hope you can deal with what you've done.
Dahmer arrived at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin in February 1992. Due to the heinous nature of his crimes, Dahmer's case gained international attention. Therefore, in the interest of his own safety, he was placed in protective custody and held in isolation. Dahmer was also kept in shackles whenever he was out of his cell. After serving for a year, Dahmer asked prison officials to reconsider their decision to keep him in protective custody. As he had been cooperative and did not have any major infractions, he was moved out of the isolation cell and into a unit for prisoners with emotional and mental health difficulties. In this new unit, Dahmer had the freedom to interact with others. In addition to sharing mealtime, he was allowed to attend classes and sign up for work duties. Although some of the activities were not supervised, Dahmer appeared to get along with everyone. Dahmer also began spending time with prison minister Roy Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe claimed Dahmer expressed sincere remorse for the crimes he committed, even suggesting he should have been put to death as punishment. Dahmer also began taking a Bible correspondence course. It was mailed to him by Kurt Booth, who was a member of Oklahoma's Crescent Church of Christ. Booth learned about Dahmer while watching news coverage about his trial. In an interview which Booth saw on television, Dahmer proclaimed that he just wanted to find a little peace. Booth said he could tell the convicted killer was hurting and sent him the course material because he wanted to help Dahmer find peace through religion. After completing the course, Dahmer expressed an interest in being baptized. However, the prison did not have a formal baptismal tank, and nobody seemed willing to bring one in. Booth eventually got in touch with Roy Ratcliffe, and they arranged for the baptism to take place in the prison's whirlpool bathtub. Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized in May 1994. Following his baptism, Dahmer purchased 25 Bible correspondence courses, which he distributed to his fellow inmates. During this time, Dahmer seemed to maintain a ghoulish sense of humor, which his fellow inmates did not appreciate. For example, Dahmer routinely made jokes about cannibalism, molded his food to resemble body parts, and routinely warned guards and his fellow inmates that he may bite them. This behavior had deadly consequences. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer and 2 inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver, were cleaning the restrooms in the prison's gym. The 3 men were alone inside the restroom for approximately 20 minutes. When the guards returned, they found Anderson and Dahmer badly beaten. Both men ultimately died as a result of the wounds inflicted by Scarver. Scarver later said he had been unnerved by Dahmer's behavior, including his habit of making his food look like dismembered bodies. Scarver also claimed that Dahmer crossed the line with a number of people in the facility, both staff and prisoners. Referring to Dahmer, he said, "Some people who are in prison are repentant, but he was not one of them." Dahmer's attorney, Gerald Boyle, believes he knew his client would be killed when he asked to be placed in a unit with other inmates. Boyle said, "Dahmer had a death wish, and I know he didn't have the gumption to do it himself, so I predicted that the day would come when he would be killed in prison."
A suspicious proposition, a terrifying threat, and a daring escape. Everything fell apart for Jeffrey Dahmer on the night he was finally caught. Jeffrey Dahmer is a well-known name to anyone familiar with the deadliest serial killers. Before he was handed down a life sentence for the murders of 17 victims in 1992, Dahmer spent years hunting and killing young men, mostly in the Milwaukee area. From the late 70s until the early 90s, he was a ruthless killer who kidnapped, lured, drugged, and tortured victims that he invited back to his apartment. Dahmer committed his first murder in 1978, just after graduating from high school. On a drive to get rid of the body, he was pulled over by the police in Ohio to perform a sobriety test, all while having the body of his first victim in the car. Thankfully, in 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's butchery came to an end. The notorious killer approached 3 men in a Milwaukee bar on July 22, 1991, offering each one $100, drinks, and a movie to come home with him to pose naked for photographs. One man, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, took Dahmer up on the offer. Arriving at Dahmer's apartment, Edwards became suspicious, not least of which was because of the horrid smell. Before he could get away, though, Dahmer pulled a knife on the young man and handcuffed him. He then forced Edwards to watch The Exorcist III. Edwards later told authorities that Dahmer put his head on his chest while they watched the movie, and while listening to his heartbeat, told Edwards that he would eat the young man's heart out. Edwards reported that Dahmer made him look in his refrigerator, where he saw a human head. From his filing cabinet, Dahmer retrieved a hand.
I was dead set on going with this compulsion. It was the only thing that gave me any satisfaction.
Before Dahmer could make his fatal strike, though, Edwards saw an opportunity. At some point in the evening, Dahmer was distracted, and Edwards punched him and escaped out the front door, still in handcuffs. Edwards flagged down 2 police officers in the street at 11:30 p.m. on the day of his ordeal. He said that a man had tried to kill him and led the officers to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer greeted those officers and allowed them to come into his home. On the lookout for material evidence, one of the officers searched Dahmer's bedside table for the key to Edwards' handcuffs. Instead of a key, however, the officer found more than 70 Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies. The officers restrained Dahmer and conducted a full check of the apartment. In the end, they found not only the head in Dahmer's refrigerator, but a human heart in a plastic bag and a set of male genitals. In Dahmer's bedroom, they found 5 human skulls and the tools that Dahmer had used for his torture and dismemberment. One of Dahmer's drawers contained a full human skeleton. Police also found a 57-gallon vat full of acid, 3 torsos, and other assorted body parts. Dahmer willingly confessed to his crimes, telling detectives, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." Some of his victims could have lived if Dahmer were caught earlier. In addition to the horrific nature of his murders, the way he got away with the crimes is still hotly debated. It's believed that Dahmer intentionally chose Black and Asian men because he believed that the police would spend less time investigating non-white victims. The Milwaukee Police Department was also heavily criticized for its handling of events that could have saved the life of one of Dahmer's victims. In a show of the department's negligence, just months before Tracy Edwards escaped, a young boy had also found a way out of Dahmer's apartment. Two young women tried to make a report to the police about a naked boy running down the street. Unfortunately, when the cops found him, they returned him to Dahmer's apartment. Police wrote off the incident as a domestic disturbance. The boy was 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasimphone, who was later killed by Dahmer and discovered as one of the many corpses in the apartment. Before that, Dahmer had spent 10 months in prison for the assault of Sinthatsimphone's brother. He was sentenced to 8 years for that crime, but wrote a letter asking for leniency, and it was granted. After murdering 14-year-old Konorak, Dahmer would kill 4 more men before Edwards' escape finally led police to his apartment in 1991. It may look pretty true to life, but there's plenty of factual inaccuracies in Netflix's Monster. Here's what the show gets wrong about the Jeffrey Dahmer story. The dramatized version of Jeffrey Dahmer's life shows him getting a job in a blood plasma clinic in Milwaukee. While there, he gets a hold of a bag of blood and sidles up to the roof, where he proceeds to consume it. This isn't strictly accurate. It's true that after being discharged from the military, where he worked as a Germany-based army medic between 1979 and 1981, he got a job as a phlebotomist in a plasma clinic. His discharge from the army happened due to accusations of alcohol abuse. After leaving, he got a job in a delicatessen, but was thrown out of the hotel he was lodging in for not paying the rent. He had stints living with his father and stepmother, as well as his aunt, punctuated by trouble with the law.
I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick.
Only a week after he moved in with his family, he was arrested for disorderly conduct related to his drinking. Dahmer was fined $60 and given a 10-day jail sentence, which was suspended. It wouldn't be the first time he was arrested on this basis. When he moved in with his aunt, Dahmer started working in the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. Yet, surprisingly for a future cannibal, Dahmer did not initially like the taste of blood. Rather than drinking a whole bag of it, he reportedly took some from the blood plasma clinic where he worked, trying a vial before spitting it out. Jeffrey Dahmer's violent rampage came to an end in 1991 when he was caught after one of his victims alerted the police, having narrowly escaped from Dahmer's apartment. The killer was tried, convicted, and given 15 consecutive life sentences. His attempt to plead insanity was rejected, and in total, he was sentenced to 941 years in prison. Yet, he would serve less than 3 of those years before meeting his ultimate fate.
I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
Fellow prisoner Christopher Scarver, another convicted murderer, had grown angry with Dahmer's behavior in prison. Scarver claimed to the New York Post that he was particularly upset over Dahmer's fondness for pretending ketchup was blood and shaping prison food into what looked like human body parts. Dahmer's murder apparently came about because Scarver felt that he was unrepentant about his crimes, something his fellow prisoner claimed he could tell from the serial killer's eyes. However, Scarver later wrote in a blog post that the Post misquoted him. Dahmer's lawyer also contested Scarver's claims, saying that taunting people wasn't his former client's style. Monster shows Scarver attacking inmate Jesse Anderson before moving on to Dahmer. However, in reality, he went for Dahmer first. Although he had initially been isolated from the other prisoners, Dahmer had requested a greater level of interaction, including being able to work and eat meals with the general prison population. He apparently used to taunt them by saying, "I bite." When left alone with Anderson and Dahmer while on cleaning duty, Scarver attacked and beat Dahmer to death before turning on Anderson. Jeffrey Dahmer stated that one of his victims, a man from the deaf community named Tony Hughes, only became known to him the night before he was murdered. This was untrue. Although Monster shows them dating over the course of 1991, in reality, they had known each other since 1989. According to the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a friend of Hughes stated that the pair had been seeing each other for 2 years before Hughes was abducted. Dahmer had visited her house at least 6 times in search of him. According to Esquire, Hughes had become a member of the deaf community when some medication he received as an infant led to a permanent loss of hearing. He also became a mute. Despite these setbacks, his mother reported that he was a happy and confident young man who had modeling aspirations while he was a college student in Madison, Wisconsin. Monster shows Hughes and Dahmer forming a relationship where Dahmer displays an unusual degree of tenderness towards the other man. Hughes was seen alive for the final time in May 1991 at Milwaukee's 219 Club. Dahmer lured him back to his apartment, drugged him, and murdered him, dismembering his body in the process and keeping his skull as a trophy. Monster shows Glenda Cleveland, the conscience of the whole saga, living in the same building as Jeffrey Dahmer. Although Cleveland lived near Dahmer and tried to alert the police, she was not his direct neighbor like the show claims. In the show, Cleveland's suspicions are piqued when she hears the disturbing sounds of screams and a body being dismembered coming through the air vent into her apartment. She takes note of this and is furious with the police as they only apprehend Dahmer when his potential 18th victim, Tracy Edwards, escapes from Dahmer's apartment and alerts them about his attempted murder. She had tried numerous times to contact the police and the FBI about her suspicions after she recognized one of the missing men as someone Dahmer had interacted with, but it was weeks until Dahmer was caught. Yet the show deviates from the truth in that Cleveland didn't live in the Oxford Apartments building. Instead, she was in a building nearby. The Milwaukee Sentinel-Journal points out that there was a moment in the Netflix show when Dahmer makes her a sandwich, something that happened to other people in his building, but was cited in particular by Pamela Bisson, one of Dahmer's neighbors. A chilling exchange of this nature happens during the show, but with Cleveland, who never experienced it. Monster, therefore, seems to fuse the characters of Bisson and Cleveland together. The officers in the Jeffrey Dahmer case faced heavy criticism rather than veneration as the show implies, even though both men saw their careers recover. In Monster, Balzerzak and Gabrish are shown receiving Officer of the Year awards for finally apprehending Dahmer. In reality, no such things happened. An AP story from 1991 shows that the men tried to defend their actions in the face of staunch criticism and a suspension from duty after it was revealed they had unknowingly returned one of Dahmer's victims to him. 14-year-old Konorak Synthasamphone had escaped naked and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment, but was returned and left there after the two patrolmen believed Dahmer's story that they were lovers and that Synthasamphone was an older man who was simply drunk. Dahmer later admitted to murdering the teenager just after the police dropped him off. The officers involved said that there seemed to be no other red flags. Both were suspended for 7 weeks and then fired. However, Balzerzak and Gabrish were both reinstated in 1994 and given around $55,000 of back pay. The judge who made the decision claimed the penalty for their conduct had been too harsh, a decision that was heavily criticized by community activists, as it was believed the men's homophobia and racism stopped any further investigation. Somsak Synthasamphone was attacked by Jeffrey Dahmer in 1988 after the older man persuaded him to come back to his apartment and pose nude for him. Somsak agreed to do it after Dahmer offered him money. Since escaping from communist-dominated Laos, the Synthasamphone family had been taking jobs as welders and machinists to support the family. Dahmer had recently moved from his grandmother's house and into an apartment of his own, giving him more space to pursue his crimes. Although he didn't try to kill the teenager, Dahmer drugged and assaulted him, causing him to flee in terror. Dahmer was arrested in September 1988, and in January 1989, he pled guilty to the charges of second-degree sexual assault and tempting a child for immoral reasons. Judge William Gardner is castigated in the show for not understanding the broken English of the father of the Synthasamphone brothers. However, Anne E. Schwartz's book Monster, The True Story of the Jeffrey Dahmer Murders, states that the family was not present for the sentencing as they were not told it was happening. Dahmer was ordered to serve a year at a work release camp, followed by a 5-year probationary period. He wrote a letter expressing remorse and was released in 1990, a decision that the New York Times highlights the family were not told about, although the Milwaukee Police Department insisted they were. Ron Flowers came perilously close to taking Jeffrey Dahmer's final body count to 18 rather than 17. Dahmer offered him assistance when he saw that Flowers was struggling with a broken-down car. Monster shows him taking Flowers back to his grandmother's house and drugging his coffee with the intention of ultimately murdering him.
There was a big element of wanting complete control over someone.
However, the Netflix series shows Dahmer's grandmother intervening to prevent it. She gets suspicious about Flowers' unconscious state despite Dahmer's claims that he simply had too much to drink, insisting on staying awake until Flowers comes around. She even goes as far as escorting the two men to the bus stop so that Dahmer makes sure Flowers gets home. The young man wakes up at the end of the bus route, being told to leave by the driver, and fully gains consciousness in hospital. Yet the tab reports this not to be true. What actually happened was that Flowers, despite being a fairly lean figure in the show, weighed 250 pounds and was deemed to be too heavy a potential corpse for Dahmer, who was unconvinced that he would be able to drag the body away to hide it. Flowers only remembered going to Dahmer's house before waking up in hospital. He claimed the other man had assaulted him, but when the police questioned Dahmer, they believed his version of events. The first episode of Monster shows Dahmer's last potential victim, Tracy Edwards, trying frantically to leave Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment after Dahmer threatens him with a knife.
He told me at that point if I wouldn't do what he said, he would kill me.
He somehow manages, despite the door to Dahmer's apartment being heavily secured with multiple locks. Edwards had been lured to Dahmer's residence by the promise of money in exchange for his posing for nude photographs. He became suspicious when he noticed foul odors and boxes of hydrochloric acid. Dahmer then handcuffed him before getting him to be the subject of his Polaroids. Edwards calmed him down when Dahmer became violent, but punched him in the face during the killer's lapse in concentration. He would later claim that Dahmer underestimated him. Upon escaping, he was able to convince the police that Dahmer had tried to kill him. The investigation of Dahmer's apartment led to his final arrest and ultimate conviction. However, the show got one detail of the scenes with Edwards wrong. There were only 2 locks on Dahmer's door. The Lad Bible describes how Edwards' account of the story changed after the incident, claiming during appearances on talk shows that there were multiple locks on the door. Additionally, the blog for the Little Dean Jail Crime Museum draws attention to a photo of the door that was taken at the crime scene, which formed a part of the police file. It only shows 2 locks. A year before his son died in prison, Jeffrey Dahmer's father Lionel wrote a book titled A Father's Story, in which he analyzes the various reasons for why his son might have turned out the way he did.
His mother didn't know, I didn't know, and apparently none of his playmates knew.
He includes his belief that his wife's addiction to various medications, including sleeping pills while pregnant with Jeffrey, hindered their son's emotional development. Monster highlights that she was diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. Yet Lionel also blames himself, with the book detailing how he had a youthful fascination with using hypnosis as a tool of control. He also had similar fantasies to his son about wondering what it would be like to murder people. In the book, he laments having not made the connection between this and his son's more psychopathic tendencies. The Netflix series shows that the book was a commercial failure, even if it gained some favorable reviews from critics. Yet the show is incorrect when it states that all 17 families of Dahmer's victims tried to sue for royalties due to Lionel not gaining permission to use their life stories. In reality, the Orlando Sentinel highlights that only 2 families tried to do this. According to Collider, the book was so commercially unsuccessful that it didn't generate enough profit to give any meaningful support to the families of Dahmer's victims. Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's mother, reportedly tried to publish an account refuting her ex-husband's claim that her health issues contributed to her son's twisted development. Such a book was never released.
A parent's love knows no bounds, but what if the child is one of America's most infamous monsters? Among the most notorious serial killers in living memory, Jeffrey Dahmer's deeds shocked the world after his arrest in 1991. Dahmer was convicted of killing 17 men and boys, murders he committed between 1978 and his capture. The unending trauma of the victims' families aside, how did Dahmer's own closest family try to process everything he did? What did Lionel and Joyce Dahmer have to say on the matter after their son's arrest, imprisonment, and murder, as they too sought to comprehend it? Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in May 1960. He was a bright and busy young boy until a routine operation for a double hernia seemed to change something inside him. He grew quieter and more isolated, and tensions between his parents, who divorced during his teenage years, could have contributed to his troubles. In a 2004 interview with Larry King, Lionel Dahmer was asked whether he noticed anything foreboding about his son. At around 12 years old, Lionel explained Dahmer began collecting dead animals he found on the roadside. His parents knew nothing about this, but Lionel said,
I mean, if I had known about the roadkill, that would have been a red flag. I would have done something immediately.
Prior to the age of 12, Lionel claimed he would have deemed Jeffrey a normal boy, if extremely shy. Hoping to give advice to other parents, Lionel continued,
Don't disregard shyness. Things can be fomenting in that young mind. Dig.
The picture appears to be that of a regretful father who was possibly too preoccupied to notice the changes coming over his troubled son. The Dahmers gave their interview to try to help parents in similar situations. Jeffrey's stepmother, Sherry, expanded on that in the interview, saying, "Anything that we could do to circumvent or prevent another Jeff would be a blessing." Sherry explained that she met Jeffrey Dahmer when he was 18, and they shared a cordial if distant relationship. His birth mother, Joyce, moved to California after she and Lionel's divorce, but made the flight to visit Dahmer several times while he was incarcerated. In an interview with Hard Copy, Joyce called her son a victim of a compulsion. Joyce maintained that she had been a good mother and that,
I knew this had to come from something outside of Jeff.
She said that it was a societal problem that people blame the mothers when their children become killers, and insisted there is something to be learned from the situation. Joyce said though Jeffrey's story was unusual, she realized every murderer has parents and extended family who must anguish over the deeds of their loved one. Joyce, who was a certified counselor, also said she was bothered that Jeffrey wasn't receiving any kind of psychological therapy in prison, nor was anyone coming in to study him to see what drove him to do such unthinkable acts.
He's not a monster, he's a human being. And I think he deserves some help.
Still, the pain of knowing the horrors her son had done, as well as the backlash from the public, eventually drove Joyce to attempt to take her own life. At one point, a new boss at her job reportedly forced her to remove her son's photo from her desk. When Jeffrey Dahmer was beaten to death in prison by inmate Christopher Scarver in November 1994, a distraught Joyce demanded, "I always asked if he was safe. Now is everyone happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone?" Joyce Dahmer died of breast cancer in 2000. As of September 2022, Lionel Dahmer is living in Ohio with his wife Sherry. In a 1994 tandem interview with Jeffrey and Lionel Dahmer, Lionel told Stone Phillips,
"Naive parent in me still says I see an innocent, shy child."
17 total victims, but a 10-year gap between the first and the second. What caused Jeffrey Dahmer to begin a killing spree so long after his first murder? Jeffrey Dahmer, who dismembered and cannibalized some of his victims, is one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. He was withdrawn as a child and had a fascination with animal carcasses. Dahmer started having a compulsion to murder in his early teen years. He also realized that he was sexually attracted to boys, and that was when he started fantasizing about sexually dominating them, as reported by ATI. It was just after his high school graduation when Dahmer killed his first victim, 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks, per biography. In 1978, Dahmer picked up Hicks, who was a complete stranger to him. He came from the mall and was on his way home when he spotted the young man. At the time, Dahmer had the family home to himself as his parents had just divorced. His father and brother moved out, while his mother sometimes had to go out of town, leaving Dahmer alone. It was during one of those times when Dahmer brought Hicks back to his home. Hicks was hitchhiking to a concert when Dahmer persuaded him to have drinks with him first. Dahmer then attacked the young man and strangled him to death before dismembering him and getting rid of the evidence. He had just killed his first victim, but it wasn't until 1987 when he would kill again. In 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer met 25-year-old Stephen Toomey at a bar, and they went home together. Toomey was Dahmer's second murder victim, and that was the start of his murder spree. Per Newsweek, Dahmer told MSNBC that he did not intend to kill Toomey. Upon waking up to find his victim's dead body, he claimed that it all started again. While this might sound like a bloodlust, Dahmer insisted that his motives for his actions were more complex. He told MSNBC, "Killing wasn't the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control to do with as I wanted."
It was almost addictive.
At that time, it had been almost 10 years after he murdered Stephen Hicks, but that doesn't mean that Dahmer didn't commit any crimes in between. According to ATI, in the years after his first murder, Dahmer had other offenses, including drugging and raping men and pleasuring himself in front of boys. After killing for a second time, he went on to murder 15 more boys and men between 1988 and 1991. He pleaded guilty to his crimes and was sentenced to 16 life terms, but he died in 1994 at the hands of a fellow inmate who attacked him with a metal bar. Although it's difficult to say why exactly Jeffrey Dahmer waited so long to kill again after his first murder, there are a few theories that attempt to make sense of his decision. According to A&E, experts say that the average age of serial killers is 29 years old, but Jeffrey Dahmer was only 18 when he committed his first murder. Criminal psychologist Eric Hickey told the outlet that Dahmer was likely still exploring at that time. He stated, "You don't see too many serial killers become serial killers as teenagers. Most of them are still exploring their sexuality, their paraphilia, and then they really start to act out more in their 20s and 30s. Elsewhere, serial killer expert Peter Vronsky said Dahmer's break between his first and second murder victims was a characteristic of serial killers. Vronsky said, "Serial killers sometimes commit their first murder by accident or spontaneously on an impulse, without much planning or fantasizing about it beforehand. Dahmer's first murder was definitely still on his mind. While in the US military during the break between his first and second murders, he spoke about his first killing. Preston Davis, who Dahmer raped during this time, told The Wrap that Dahmer bragged about killing his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Davis said Jeffrey had killed his first victim a year before joining the military, and he would get drunk in the barracks and say, "I killed the guy in Ohio," and we'd say, "You didn't kill nobody." Interestingly, Davis believes that Dahmer would have killed him if he had a proper escape route. Davis told The Wrap, "The reason he couldn't kill me? We were out in the middle of Belgium, and he had no idea how to get back to Germany." Dahmer was discharged from the military in 1981 due to his alcohol abuse. Davis said the killer became a monster once he started drinking and resumed killing in 1987.
What makes a killer kill? Nobody knows for sure, but Jeffrey Dahmer's father has got an idea of his own. One of the most notorious serial killers in American history was Jeffrey Dahmer. He wasn't the most prolific. That would almost certainly be Samuel Little, who confessed to murdering over 90 women between 1970 and 2005. But Dahmer's story may be the most salacious of those attributed to American serial killers. Dahmer's crimes extended beyond just the 17 victims he killed. He also sexually assaulted his victims, dismembered them, and engaged in cannibalism and necrophilia. The American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress posits that serial killers such as Dahmer are made, not born. Or put another way, while the typical murderer might kill due to a family conflict, gang violence, or to gain money, a serial killer acts for psychological reasons. For this reason, criminologists and psychologists tend to gravitate toward the circumstances of killers' childhoods. One study by research criminologist Lonnie Athens claims that modern geneticists tend to focus not on the nature-nurture debate, but on the many complex interactions that take place between people and their environments during their lives. For his part, Jeffrey Dahmer's father believed that there was one particular point in his son's childhood that set him on the path to becoming a serial killer, when he underwent a routine operation at the age of 4. What's his logic? Well, it's worth pointing out that Jeffrey Dahmer wasn't the first serial killer whose crimes included a sexual component, or so-called trophies taken from the victims, nor would he be the last. But Dahmer's evil desires have certainly been among the most infamous aspects of his many crimes.
I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick.
Dahmer had committed sexual assault before his murder spree began. He went on to commit other murders and sexually assaulted at least some of his victims. However, it's what he did after the murders that's particularly shocking. Dahmer committed necrophilic acts on the corpses and frequently dismembered the bodies. Some parts he would eat, others he would preserve for display. As it turns out, Dahmer's father posits that his son may have been compelled to such sexual deviance due to a childhood surgery that took place near his own sex organs. Though major surgery is nothing to sneeze at, hernia operations are routine, even in children. Jeffrey Dahmer underwent such a procedure as a 4-year-old boy, and his father believes that this routine surgery was the starting point of his son's gradual transition into a murderer. Lionel Dahmer told Women's Health that his son had experienced other traumatic events as a child, but thinks that operation was a particularly important catalyst. He said, "All these things came to a cumulative ending and it hooked on. I firmly believed it hooked into his sexuality at age 14 or 15. The authors of the book Mythologies of Violence in Postmodern Media came to a similar conclusion. The book argues, the operation may have been necessary to cure a birth defect, but the experience was so painful for the child that he asked Joyce, his mother, if the doctors had cut off his penis. As possible evidence that he was obsessed with genital mutilation, someone pointed out that Dahmer preserved at least one penis from one of his victims. Of course, it bears noting that this sort of retroactive diagnosis of a psychiatric problem is a fool's game under the best of circumstances. Indeed, there is zero evidence that the elder Mr. Dahmer's theory is true. If you or anyone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, help is available. Visit the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network website or contact RAIN's National Helpline at 1-800-656-HOPE 4673. Lionel Dahmer finally had enough. The middle-aged man's frustrations with his son Jeffrey were mounting over the last several years. Ohio State University, also known as OSU, was the first of several failures. The Lantern, OSU's newspaper, reports that Dahmer was an on-campus resident for half a semester that fall, but either dropped out or was expelled. The publication reports that little is known about Dahmer's academic career, as his transcripts are under hold. Following his college debacle, Dahmer was encouraged to join the military. He signed up for a 3-year enlistment, hoping to become a military police officer. Instead, he trained as a U.S. Army medic and was stationed in Germany, as reported by Yahoo News. While in Germany, he began to drink excessively. His command staff became aware of his alcoholism and determined that it was making him unfit for duty, and another service member accused Dahmer of sexual assault. Dahmer was eventually discharged from the military a year after he joined. When he was discharged, the Army gave him a one-way ticket to wherever he wanted. He chose Miami, Florida, and began a job in a delicatessen. His drinking, however, soon resulted in his eviction from the motel he was staying in, ultimately leaving him homeless on the beach, according to the Galveston Daily News. He moved back to Ohio with his father and stepmother for a brief period in 1981, but was soon sent packing to live with his grandmother in hopes that he would get his life together. By the time Dahmer moved in with Lionel's mother, Catherine, his body count was relatively low, as he had only killed one person. This person was Stephen Hicks. The summer he graduated from high school, Dahmer picked up Hicks, the young hitchhiker, and bludgeoned him to death. He later scattered his remains in the backyard. Dahmer took his second life in 1987 when he beat Stephen Toomey to death in a hotel room. He packed Toomey's body in luggage and returned to his grandmother's house, where he dismembered it and put it out for the trash. He eventually lured 14-year-old James Edward Dockstader and 22-year-old Richard Guerrero back to Grandma Dahmer's house in 1988, both of whom he murdered. Dahmer dismembered their bodies and put them out for the trash like Toomey's. In 1989, Dahmer murdered 24-year-old Anthony Sears, the last victim killed at his grandmother's house, according to biography. Sears was the first victim who Dahmer kept anatomical parts of, which were recovered after he was arrested in 1991. Dahmer would sometimes keep the bodies of his victims around for days after he killed them, before dismembering them and disposing of them. As far as Grandma goes, she was unaware of the disturbing activities on her property, at least for a little while. While her eyes were averted from her grandson's murderous actions, Catherine's nose caught onto some clues that something wasn't right. According to Distractify in 1988, Catherine Dahmer began to notice foul smells coming from the basement. Even though he eventually put the body parts out with the trash, before Dahmer worked to dismember his victims' bodies in her basement, he had a habit of keeping them around for a bit before disposing of them. The smells of decomposition, as can be imagined, did not go unnoticed, and Catherine began to complain to her grandson about it. He was dismissive of her complaints, blaming the odors on his taxidermy hobby.
She didn't want to know what was going on in the basement.
The smell of his victims' bodies is what led Catherine to eject Dahmer from her home that same year. Though he was able to move back in several months later, he didn't stay there long. In 1990, Dahmer moved into an apartment, living there until his July 1991 arrest. In less than 2 years at that apartment, Dahmer took the lives of an additional 12 men and teenage boys. Comfortable in his own space, Dahmer began collecting anatomical parts of many of his victims. When he was arrested, police were overcome with the smell of rotting human flesh. Their search yielded body parts in the refrigerator and freezer, as well as stashed away inside a large vat in his bedroom, as reported by biography. Between 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer savagely murdered and mutilated 17 men in a flurry of ruthless bloodshed that shocked and appalled the world. He was sentenced to 16 life sentences and sent to Columbia Correctional Institution, only to later be murdered by a fellow inmate in 1994. In the wake of his chilling legacy, true crime fans and psychological experts alike have pondered over the ominous catalyst that drove Dahmer to carry out his crimes. Prior to his grisly demise, Jeffrey Dahmer gave numerous interviews. In a strange manner of humble composure, he delivered explanations that chilled people to the bones. As Dahmer shared with Dateline NBC shortly after his conviction,
The killing was just a means to an end. That was the least satisfactory part. I didn't enjoy doing that.
according to the infamous killer, the origins of his desire to kill were a far more sinister, sadistic nature. Jeffrey Dahmer's slew of murders began in 1978 when he was a mere teenager. Shortly after graduating high school, he was driving down a road near his home when he noticed a young man hitchhiking.
I had this reoccurring fantasy of meeting a hitchhiker on the road.
Stephen Hicks was only 18 years old when he stepped into Dahmer's car and followed the would-be killer into his house for a few drinks. Upon entering, Hicks was struck over the head and strangled with a barbell. Dahmer later admitted to dismembering the body and hiding the separate parts in the woodland surrounding his home. 9 years would pass before he took his second victim. Perhaps the most infamous and shocking tale of Dahmer's insatiable killing spree took place in September of 1991. A naked 14-year-old boy, Konorak Synthesymphone, managed to escape Dahmer's apartment, only to be returned by police officers after the killer convinced them that the hysterical individual was his intoxicated boyfriend. He also told the authorities that the boy was 19 years old, which they accepted as truth. The boy, who happened to be the brother of a teenager Dahmer had molested years earlier, was killed upon his return to the residence. Dahmer would go on to murder 4 more men before his arrest. On July 22, 1991, Tracy Edwards miraculously escaped Dahmer's apartment and flagged down police, still wearing handcuffs that the killer had applied to his wrists. Exhilarated and terrified, he explained to the two officers that a freak had captured him and that he'd spent the better part of 5 hours trying to escape. According to Edwards, Dahmer overpowered him and put him in handcuffs while he was admiring the host's fish tank. He had a mind to jump from a nearby window or run to the front door as soon as the opportunity presented itself, but his captor was vigilant not to allow such a chance. He managed to appease Dahmer by repeatedly assuring him that he wasn't going to run away, and after convincing him to let him use the bathroom, he struck the killer in the head and bolted for the door. Reluctantly, he followed the authorities back to Dahmer's apartment to retrieve the key for the handcuffs. When they arrived, they encountered a literal museum of horrors. Boiled heads, dismembered body parts in the fridge, and the foul stench of decaying corpses adorned the entire homestead. Exhumation of the victims' bodies and Polaroid photos that Dahmer had taken before and after he'd killed them led to his arrest and ultimate conviction. As for what drove his twisted crimes, during his interview with Dateline NBC, Dahmer revealed,
No, the killing wasn't the objective. I just wanted to have the person under my complete control.
Dahmer was driven by a primordial and sexual craving to keep his unfortunate subjects captive, satisfying his erotic pleasures whenever he wanted. That said, it rarely worked out for him. In several instances, including with the 14-year-old victim's synthesophone, he drilled a hole into the victim's skull and injected acid directly into their brain, inevitably resulting in their death.
I tried to create living zombies.
Dahmer even admitted to consuming parts of his victims' bodies later on in his spree.
It made me feel like they were a permanent part of me.
Ultimately, Dahmer revealed that he was attempting to gain control over his victims so that he could do what he wanted without consequence. As he told Dateline,
There was a big element of wanting complete control over someone.
If you or anyone you know has been a victim of sexual assault, help is available. Visit the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network website or contact RAIN's National Helpline at 1-800-656-HOPE-4673. Did Jeffrey Dahmer regret his heinous crimes? And why did he keep trophies of his victims? Here's what a true crime expert has to say. Among the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's 1993 Inside Edition interview is the frank openness and honesty with which the convicted killer explains his motive to commit a string of brutal murders involving sexual assault and, in some cases, torture and cannibalism. Dahmer attributes these acts to a sexual urge for complete domination and control, and a fear of abandonment. In that regard, true crime expert and creator of the YouTube channel That Chapter, Mike O, finds Dahmer's words believable. He said, "The explanation he gives is in line with what we see from many serial killers. The rush, the addiction, the need for complete domination of another." Dahmer was known to pick up his victims in Milwaukee nightlife establishments. He then lured them home, where he often offered his victims a sleeping pill concoction he'd prepared before he had even left his home that day.
Person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled.
He was only caught when one of his potential victims, Tracy Edwards, escaped, and police found Polaroid pictures of Dahmer's victims in his apartment and arrested him. As O adds, that level of preparation that Dahmer described in the TV interview is also typical. He explained, first he got the necessary items to commit his crimes ready, in hope that he would find his perfect victim for the night. Then he would take home his chosen man, all the while he knew he was about to kill him. He has thought it through and knows exactly what and how he will go about doing it. During the Inside Edition prison interview, Dahmer was asked about how he was able to both mentally and emotionally commit such heinous crimes. According to Dahmer's own words, it didn't happen overnight. Dahmer's first murder took place in the late 1970s, and there were many years before he killed again. While it may be surprising to us, this slow escalation does fit the serial killer profile, according to O. Also, Dahmer did seem to understand what he did was wrong, which is also unsurprising from a serial killer's point of view. O said, "At the beginning, even after committing his first murder, he was able to control his urges, but fantasies evolve, so did his, up to the point where the urge to act out on them became stronger and stronger. Once Dahmer indulged himself, there was no end in sight." O went on to explain, "The thrill and satisfaction they gain from the crimes only last so long, and they need to feel them again, and so they keep committing crimes." As was the case with Dahmer, the murders became more gruesome and personal each time. O elaborated, "Serial killers often will get used to the rush they feel of their acts, like it's an addiction, and so they have to keep going further and further with it each time." According to O, Dahmer wanted total control over his victims and to ultimately create the perfect companion for himself, a goal he failed at several times but never stopped trying to pursue until he was arrested. As was revealed by Dahmer during his Inside Edition interview and also in Dahmer's trial, he was known to take Polaroid pictures and to keep pieces of his victims' dead bodies.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
With sexual serial murders such as Dahmer, keeping trophies of this type is quite common, according to O. It's a means by which they can relive the perverse thrill of murder and also prolong the sexual satisfaction they experienced in the act of it. As O goes on to add, Dahmer had abandonment issues, so keeping body parts was his way of ensuring that his victims would never truly leave him. In Dahmer's own words, nothing but incarceration would have stopped the killing. If psychological intervention happened for Dahmer much earlier in his life, O believes help could have been possible and lives could have been saved. By the time he was arrested, though, O tends to agree that locking Dahmer up is the only thing that could have prevented him from reoffending. He said, "I don't believe someone who has committed crimes of this magnitude could be treated in such a way that they wouldn't pose a highly possible harm to society. Of course, there is hope for positive psychological treatment, but definitely not in Dahmer's case, at least not by the time he has been imprisoned." Another harrowing moment in the Inside Edition interview comes when Dahmer speaks candidly about his second victim, Stephen Tuomi, the first person he killed after the unplanned murder he committed in the late 1970s. O said, "He was his second victim, but the one that blew the doors wide open." According to Dahmer, in the midst of his killing spree, he often drank heavily and reached a blacked-out state before the act was completed. As a result, he often had no memory of what had happened. As O explains, it's known that Dahmer abused alcohol from the time he was a teenager. His reported blackouts while killing could be induced by too much alcohol consumption alone, and not necessarily an underlying psychological condition. According to O, the blacked-out state Dahmer described when Tuomi was killed could have also been, quote, the simple fact that his brain blocked the memory of him killing Stephen as protection against the trauma. After his sentencing to 16 life sentences for killing 17 young men and boys, Dahmer seemed unable to come to terms with his crimes, according to his own words. However, this doesn't mean he felt remorse for what he had done. Watching the footage, O recognized that Dahmer was haunted by his acts, pointing out once again that he had to drink in order to kill. He also pointed out that Dahmer needed to gather himself up before he spoke about the horrific acts he committed, as those memories overwhelmed him. The lack of remorse Dahmer displayed is in keeping with the mental state of many serial killers after they commit their crimes. O said, "Serial killers, just as Dahmer himself said, turn humans in their heads from living, feeling creatures into things to be used by them. When you buy a mug and you then break it, either be it a mistake or on purpose, you don't feel remorse for it, right? That is how they see their victims. It also makes it easier to commit their heinous crimes having this mindset." In killers like Dahmer, the empathy centers of their brains are non-existent. O elaborated, "It's a compulsion they know is wrong, but do it anyway and without regret."
You'd have to be crazy to commit the kinds of crimes that Jeffrey Dahmer went to prison for. So how was he declared legally sane? Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991, after one of his would-be victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape from Dahmer's Milwaukee apartment and alert a pair of passing police patrolmen. After Edwards led the officers to the apartment from which he had escaped, they discovered Polaroid pictures of dismembered bodies. Initially, Dahmer tried to resist arrest, but he was quickly overpowered. As police searched the apartment, they uncovered horrors beyond imagination.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons.
Despite his trying to evade capture after police uncovered his crimes, Dahmer later offered full cooperation with the police in interviews, choosing to speak without a lawyer present and to lay out all of his recollections of his brutal slayings. He was also entirely open concerning the monstrous sexual acts he committed to the remains. While assisting police in identifying his victims, according to Brian Masters' The Shrine of Jeffrey Dahmer, he said, "I created this horror, and it only makes sense I do everything to put an end to it." Dahmer also assisted by admitting his guilt in the courtroom, meaning that rather than the jury being tasked with ascertaining his guilt or not, their role was to determine whether he was sane, and therefore responsible for his actions when he committed them. Dahmer's trial featured testimony from expert psychiatrists who had interviewed the serial killer to provide evidence to the jury. It was the jury's difficult task to ascertain whether Dahmer was indeed certifiably sane, despite the severity of his actions. The psychiatrists diagnosed Dahmer with 4 personality disorders that underpinned his actions. As the Washington Post reported, the personality disorders themselves didn't amount to his being insane in the legal sense, For that to happen, 10 of the jurors would have to agree that either Dahmer was unable to tell whether his actions were morally wrong or was unable to prevent himself from doing them as a result of a mental disease. However, his disorders weren't considered mental diseases that would affect him in such a way, with details of his case including his use of subterfuge to dupe police officers, showing that he had the power of self-control when required. Dahmer was also a selective killer whose crimes were committed with a high degree of premeditation. Indeed, the report notes that despite attempting to plead insanity, his defense team's efforts were hampered by Dahmer's own admission that he knew his actions were wrong, meaning that their only chance to convince the jury that he was insane was to show he could not prevent himself from killing. Milwaukee County District Attorney A. Michael McCann said at the time, "The tragedy here is I think he could have stopped at any time."
This defendant never again has the opportunity to walk the streets of our community.
In a piece written for Psychology Today, psychologist Travis Langley explains why the jury in the Jeffrey Dahmer case came to their decision. While many Americans surely wanted to see Dahmer face justice for his crimes, those crimes didn't immediately inspire notions of sanity. Many would have found his actions to be the very definition of insanity. But the laws around guilt and insanity verdicts are difficult to secure in court. Those laws were largely influenced by John Hinckley Jr.'s failed assassination attempt against President Ronald Reagan. That court case resulted in proving insanity in court much more difficult. So by the time Dahmer was being sentenced, he didn't meet the criteria. Ironically, Hinckley's crime, which was found to have been driven by delusions, was considered the work of an insane man. But Dahmer's more disturbing and horrifying crimes weren't. Had Jeffrey Dahmer been found criminally insane, it is highly probable that he wouldn't have been sent to prison, but rather would have been housed at a maximum security psychiatric hospital, where he would have received treatment with the possibility of being released once he was deemed to have been cured. Instead, he was housed at Portage, Wisconsin's Columbia Correctional Institution. There he was kept with other killers, many of whom remained dangerous behind bars. On November 28, 1994, 2 years after he'd been sentenced to life imprisonment for 15 murders of young men and boys, Dahmer, who was then 34, was bludgeoned to death by inmate Christopher Scarver when they were left unsupervised in the prison gym. Though some of the relatives of Dahmer's victims reportedly celebrated news of Dahmer's death, others felt that he had evaded justice, with one mother stating, "The hurt is worse now because he's not suffering like we are." Whether Dahmer would have remained alive, was he housed in a mental institution rather than prison, is something we will never know.